Ezekiel Thornfield was attempting to polish his greatest boots as the drums of war began. He froze when the sound waved through Cedar Canyon. He was still holding the leather cloth as the steady hammering reflected off the canyon walls that wouldn't resemble thunder, so today was meant to be the day. At last, Catherine came from Kansas. City had spent 3 days by himself on this property. Years spent establishing a life in the most remote valley in Colorado. The closest neighbor was 15 miles distant. He has loved it that way up until now. There was just one meaning for the drums: the Kiowa, an army that had been conducting raids. Communities 50 miles to the south were heading north, and Ezekiel, they were too close. Entered his porch and saw his worn grabbing the wooden railing. With their hands, the afternoon sun created lengthy shadows on his land, but something sensed the cattle weren't different. No longer grazing in peace, they were huddled close to the barn, anxious, and even Marshall, his dog, was agitated. Gently whimpering, his ears flat against he took his father's old spy's head. Glass from the cabin's interior and scaled what? He observed through the roof. His blood ran cold and dark through the lens. Along the ridgeline, figures were in motion. He could count at least a dozen, but they were neither scouts nor a little raid party. As he further shifted the emphasis, shapes emerged, and there were more placed at each of the exits of the valley. The insight came to him like a physical assault. This was not a raid. Weren't going through 400 combatants. Perhaps more had encircled everything. They had transformed Cedar Canyon into his haven. Ezekiel's throat dried up as he fell into a trap. He considered Catherine's stage. The coach was expected to arrive prior to taking the main trail that went to the sunset, straight through the now enemy land that she was unaware of riding without realizing the man she'd decided to wed without seeing each other had just become the most hazardous individual to be throughout the entire region of Colorado. He descended from the roof, his thoughts when racing. It might be wise to grab his horse and attempt to flee by the creek bed that is narrow on the eastern side. Perhaps he could elude them in the increasing darkness, but that would imply leaving Catherine to face whatever comes her way as her stagecoach awaited her. The war drums enter this valley of death, became louder and more adamant that they weren't no longer only announcing their presence. They were cooperating and exchanging messages. Whatever they were planning, it had to do with to start, but Ezekiel was unaware of was that this war party's leader had been waiting for weeks, watching him for this precise moment and its arrival. Ezekiel's bride wasn't a coincidence. His hands were shaking as he loaded his Winchester. 43 rounds of ammo, counting the math, was easy compared to 400 warriors, and horrifying as he had heard tales of what became of the lone settlers who was apprehended by war parties of this magnitude. He believed that one of those tales ended happily. Regarding Catherine's most recent letter, she had scrawled something in the pocket of his shirt. On her eagerness to meet him at last regarding the new gown she had purchased for their nuptials, about beginning again in the area in Colorado where no one was aware her background, and she trusted him to keep her safe, to provide her with the life she had always desired. He might now murder her simply by the war drum abruptly ceased playing. In some ways, the quiet was worse than the Ezekiel ears pounded, straining for any sound, but the wind also appeared to have died down. Of his livestock had disappeared. As though they were still clutching their breath, this was the quiet before. A horrible incident occurred, and then I heard hoofbeats instead of thunder. He anticipated a charge, but the steady single horse's clip-clop was coming. His heart pounded as he walked south, against his ribcage when he became aware of that. Someone was riding straight, ignorant of the soldiers, into the trap arranged on each crest. Through he saw the rider through a spyglass. A young Kiowa was courageous, but there was a problem. The warrior raised his hands, and he held a white cloth that was fastened to a long put-a-truce flag on the horse, and it moved, like the rider gently and deliberately desired to be viewed from afar. The 3 years of Ezekiel's life were filled with this valley was his first home. Direct involvement in any tribal conflict, he had heard that they occasionally took prisoners in order to negotiate, but this felt the brave was more intimate and distinct. making his way directly to his cabin as he knew where to look for the rider. 50 yards away from the porch well, stopped close enough to a gun, but far enough to demonstrate that he wasn't seeking an instant. He was young, perhaps 20, when he fought elaborate war paint that covers half of his face. But what drew Ezekiel's eye, the man's eyes weren't brimming with the fury he anticipated. They appeared nearly content, as if everything was proceeding as planned. The courageous person named out in English with a strong accent, Thornfield. We must discuss the reality that ice was sent by this guy who knew his name. Ezekiel's veins pumped blood onto he had his porch gun ready, but it wasn't aimed yet. Described the warrior's lips. Formed what could have been a grin. Regarding the woman you're trying to find, why are we actually here? He hesitated. Allowing the decision to sink in, you will need to determine when she in 2 hours, the stagecoach will arrive. But what next would shatter, the brave said. All that Ezekiel believed he understood. The brave's words struck Ezekiel on this day. As if to say, your bride isn't Thornfield, she's accidentally come here. Arriving since someone specifically told her where to look for you and when. His rifle's grip tightened. What are you Catherine and I have been discussing for months? She decided to write letters to the warrior, shook his head and said, come here. Slowly, anyone can write a letter. The woman you believe to be your acquaintance isn't exist. He reached into a purse made of leather and took out a piece of folded paper, which is Catherine Morrison, the genuine one who died of 3 weeks ago. Kansas City experienced a fever. As the blood left Ezekiel's face, the paper was thrown to the ground by Brave. Even from a distance, between them, it was evident to Ezekiel that it was an official certificate of death for the woman he had been intending to wed, the woman who had wrote him several lovely letters regarding they had already buried their future together. Who's coming in a Kansas graveyard then? Coach Ezekiel's voice on that platform was someone who is in need of you is seldom audible. She looks like Catherine Morrison. Someone who is worthy of 400 brave warriors' eyes shone with something that appeared to like feeling sorry for someone you've met but you don't recall her before. Nothing made sense as Ezekiel's mind whirled. Why would anyone endure such complex deception who could be worthwhile to encircle a whole valley? With a war party, he reflected on trying to recall any woman from his past who might be motivated to deceive him. You're lying, he stated in this manner, but his too many pieces and a lack of confidence in the voice were arranging themselves. The letters had always seemed too ideal as well. Realizing Catherine had never inquired for particular information regarding his property, never asked why he had selected such a remote area, that she had agreed to things without the genuine curiosity. A lady would have been courageous, said. 3 years ago, you lived with a different man. Location where you performed actions that left scars on lives of people. He pointed to the lines of ridge where the other fighters. She paid us to wait and see that you unable to run when she gets there. But she wants to gaze directly into your eyes as she tells you. Feeling Ezekiel's legs revealed who she truly is. Weak, this was not always the case. Valley prior to his attempt to become when he was a modest rancher. He wore an emblem and created adversaries when his decisions had repercussions. He had believed that people were going to die. 3 years of life were buried. Being alone had been sufficient punishment for the faraway sound of wheels pierced the air. In his mind, a stagecoach was approaching. The southern track is barely discernible through. The woman inside the canyon's mouth thought she was going to meet her future spouse, but she was actually on her way to bring about justice, which took 3 years. Long overdue, but the woman's identity on that stage carriage would ruin all that Ezekiel believed he understood. His coach rolled closer after he passed the stage, as well as Ezekiel hearing the driver conversing with his horses without realizing that he was transporting his client in the middle of a meticulously designed trap. The brave closely examined Ezekiel's face, as though he was researching each and every feeling. That, you still don't remember, do you? Crossed it? You? Sheriff, the warrior said. Deadwood Creek's Thornfield, the man who buried innocent victims in the ground, because he was too arrogant to acknowledge that incorrect. The words struck Ezekiel as bullets. The name of Sheriff Thornfield is he attempted to bury the badge he'd 3 years ago, tossed into a river. Recollections of the raid came pouring back. The family was trapped in the trade post. The young girl who'd been in the crossfire as the bullets flew, he yelled, having been so certain that he was pursuing the appropriate men, so sure that he was fair to the boundary, but he had been completely mistaken. Ezekiel of the Morrison family murmured. The entire horror struck him at last. Catherine Morrison would not be attending Marry Me. She had already passed away due to the courageous me. Gave her sister a gloomy nod. Sarah barely made it through the day. After 2 years of preparation, this moment of learning everything about you is being tracked down. When you vanished, he pointed to she wrote about the stagecoach that was arriving. She changed her name to Catherine in those letters. Every method that was important in order to near enough to meet your gaze. Ezekiel lowered his hands, which were shaking. He recalled Sarah Morrison with his rifle. The 12-year-old girl is now hiding behind a flipped wagon as her family suffered bleeding. He had been too preoccupied with digging in the soil, pursuing the criminals, to observe that his posse's crazed firing had struck defenseless individuals. By the time he became aware of his 3 Morrison members made a mistake. Little and other family members were deceased. The stagecoach, Catherine, was just a handful of now 100 yards away. Via his spy, Ezekiel was able to glimpse a woman, Sarah Morrison's silhouette in the window, now an adult and coming to pick up a debt that has been accruing for 3 years. What is it she desires? Ezekiel inquired, although he was already aware of the solution. Justice that you never provided her, family. Although the brave's tone was icy, respectfully, yet, she may have just imploring us to murder you would have been easier, but she wanted you to understand why. You wanted to remember that you were dying. Their expressions when the sound finally stopped. The sound of wheels on gravel increased in volume. The driver began to slow down after noticing Sarah. The cabin ahead. In minutes Morrison would leave that platform, coach, and confront the man who ruined her. Growing up in a sea of misguided, Ezekiel considered fleeing from the gunfire. His steed was prepared and saddled in the barn. But 400 fighters encircled the valley, and more significantly, he was aware that he deserved all Sarah had in store. He had been trying to forget him for 3 years. Deadwood Creek's events, but when the living are around, the dead don't stay buried. Refused to allow the stagecoach to rest. Stopped in front of his cabin, and the driver shouted and tipped his cap. Cheerfully, Mr. Thornfield's delivery got your bride safely here. However, what transpired when Sarah Morrison exited that stage? The carriage would demonstrate that certain wounds never go away and certain debts can only be settled with blood. The door of the stage carriage opened, and a woman down onto the arid terrain. She was not at all what Ezekiel had envisioned. This woman would be Catherine Morrison. Had dark hair pulled and was tall and slender. Back badly and eyes that included the chilly fire of a person who had experienced pain for too long. So she wore a straightforward traveling attire, but there was something he was reminded of her movement. Of a predator around Sarah, its victim. Morrison bore a striking resemblance to her father. The similarity was so striking that it made the same shame tightened Ezekiel's chest. Powerful jawline and intense blue eyes, the same posture that implied she would not give up on anything whatsoever. The driver of the stagecoach climbed chattering as she descended to unpack her trunk, thinking about the lovely weather and the beautiful surroundings he was unaware of. He had just brought her a woman. 400 soldiers, or that family's killer were? Seeing whatever he did from the Sarah paid the driver on the nearby mountains, and cheerfully sent him on his way. She waited, but it never made it to her eyes, till the stagecoach vanished from view. The curve before she looked in directly from Ezekiel. The change was instantaneous and cooling. The enjoyable mask for the advantage of the driver she had worn slipped away and was replaced with 3 years of well-cultivated animosity. "Hey, Sheriff Thornfield," she said in a firm voice. "And remain composed, or do you like Ezekiel better now? Let's say men like you adopt new names as effortlessly as you go between towns." Ezekiel set his weapon against the railing of the porch, pretending no longer served any purpose. "Sarah, you've matured so well." The effects of surviving a massacre on an individual she approached with measured steps. I determined that I was 12 years old when you entered our trading post on horseback with your shooting imaginary weapons, pursuing shadows and calling it justice, the courageous who delivered the message while it was still mounted. Observing the altercation with the patience of a person who understood just how Ezekiel could finish this behind him. Observe additional fighters taking up positions along the non-threatening canyon cliff, simply there to make sure he understood. Sarah, running was not an option. Halted 10 feet from the porch. Spent 2 years trying to find you after you were not seen in Deadwood Creek 2. Years of studying to become a lonely woman in need of 2 lovers. Catherine spent years honing her voice. So you'd be shocked to hear why Ezekiel, even though he knew it was a dumb question, asked, "Why don't they just kill me? Why endure all of Sarah's laughter?" Was harsh and abrasive due to a bullet would have been too simple and too fast. Wanted you to believe by first hoping you had discovered joy. To believe that you'd avoided the harm you inflicted on my family. Eyes glistened with tears that had not yet been cried. Having been delayed for 3 years, I desired to experience what we did when you're instead of the outlaws, gunshots found us. You truly wanted to know if you were having fun. This tale, be sure to sign up for our channel for other amazing stories from the Old West, but Sarah's subsequent remarks would demonstrate the full scope of her scheme. Was the reason she had brought a whole war party to observe this instance of Sarah reached into her reckoning traveling bag and extracted a tiny. Ezekiel recognized the wooden box. It had instantly belonged to her. The elderly father, Thomas Morrison, had he carved it personally, preserving his best priceless items inside while observing it. Sarah's hands now held Ezekiel's. Does your stomach turn with new guilt? Recall what you told me that day? Sarah asked, in a barely controlled voice. After the gunfire ceased and you recognized the actions of your posse, Ezekiel shut his eyes. Recalling striking him as though with a bodily punch, I said I apologized for the accident, that we were pursuing men who were dangerous and that these events take place on the forest. Sarah concluded, my family was at the wrong moment and in the wrong place. I should be thankful that you were able to capture the actual criminals before they could cause harm. She opened the wooden box for everyone else, and Ezekiel noticed a glinting object. Inside is something worse than a weapon. Proof, but you were never able to capture the sheriff. Did you give up on the genuine outlaws? The pursuit of what transpired with us determined that the case was also excessively messy. Too much paperwork, too complicated. The courageous, his eyes moved as he shifted in his saddle between Ezekiel and Sarah as he was observing a meticulously planned performance, which was more than just retaliation, but this was about something more significant. Sarah took a folded piece of paper out of the box. I discovered the men you were pursuing me hard that day, so 3 years later she unfolded and I found them. The article that disclosed wanted posters and solemn declarations that they remain alive, continuing to rob and kill because you were too embarrassed by your era to hit the words to continue what you started. Ezekiel was more resilient than any bullet. Possessing his shame and disgust over the deaths of Morrison's family, whom he had left behind his badge and ran away into the woods. It was penance, he told himself. It was leaving a position that he was too risky to carry out, yet the reality was easier and more cowardly. He would have fled away from his obligations. The 14 more victims have been killed by the Garrett gang, Sarah continued her journey since Deadwood Creek, voice getting louder by the second 14 individuals. Who would remain alive if you'd completed your work rather than fleeing to Ezekiel felt like playing cowboy in this valley. The burden of those fatalities mounting his shoulders so badly that he would slaughtered innocent individuals with his carelessness, yet being aware that his more deaths have resulted from cowardice. Families being destroyed gave him the impression that Sarah held up, drowning in guilt. This is a territorial document. The Garrett gang's warrant is still in effect. She looked at him and saw that he was still active. With unwavering resolve, you're going to assist me in completing what you began 3 years ago. You're going to assist me in hunting them down, and Ezekiel asked if I would, even though he was previously aware of the response. Sarah pointed to the warriors who were positioned around the canyon. followed by my companions here, will ensure that you don't leave this valley, but you won't return once you die. My family and the Garretts won't quit, gang, from murdering additional defenseless persons. As she moved closer, her eyes blazed with goal. I desire justice, Ezekiel Real. Justice, not merely retaliation. The courageous first conversation. Since Sarah's arrival, you have a choice, former sheriff. You either live or die here as a coward. Long enough to possibly make a little redemption. But Sarah's revelation next regarding the most recent target. Ezekiel would have to make the hardest choice of his life, extracted a last document from the Ezekiel could see her in. The wooden box. Hands shaking a little for the first amount of time since she got to the Garrett, the gang is not merely murdering unidentified tourists. They've organized themselves now, Ezekiel. Being more astute, she gave him a message. Dated, they were only going to hit 5 days ago. Next week, the kids' train will be Ezekiel's. As he read the telegram, his blood turned cold. Each month, a dedicated train transported children who are orphaned from overcrowded new families in the eastern cities. 43 kids in the western regions who are 6 years old would be on that train. Helpless from 15 children seeking new homes and hope in Millfield, the train pauses to take on Sarah, carried on with her solitary position. No police for 50 meters in. The gang is aware of the train's direction. Has adoption costs in a sturdy box? And family expenses, they don't give a damn. Children will become entangled in the conflict. The courageous solemnly nodded. We've been after weeks of pursuing the Garrett gang. They have 30 men who are now desperate and well armed. This raid has been planned for. Ezekiel felt worse and more naive for months. Sarah's children had been 3 years old. More families were ruined years ago. Because he had been too cowardly. To complete the design he had begun was evident that his failures continued to multiply. Why are we causing more suffering and more victims? Ezekiel asked me if I could take this. Details for the territorial marshal, anyone with actual authority in the cavalry. I tried, but Sarah's chuckle was bitter. Claimed that the intelligence was untrustworthy, due to the fact that it originated from indigenous sources. Won't follow. The Kia warrior's instructions, even when the lives of children are at danger. She pointed to the courageous runner. The gang has been observed by Elks, collecting data in an effort to stop heinous slaughter, but white officials won't pay attention to them. Speaking elk up, our kids have been adopted. Those trains that have been taken from their scent to boarding schools and families. We understand the significance of children being his voice, taken away from those who love them, carried a lot of sorrow, and we won't allow more children die because adults also die. Glad to collaborate with you. Ezekiel acknowledged the entire extent of Sarah's plans. This was more than just her seeking retribution. Families passing. She had formed a partnership between her pursuit of fairness and the Kiowa's intention to shield innocent children. She had transformed his remorse into a weapon that could help the train save lives. Arrives in Millfield in 4 days, Sarah stated. If we push, we can arrive in 3. Do you know the tactics used by the Garrett gang? Superior to everyone. You understand how they consider how things function. She hesitated. Allowing the moment's wait to settle. Ezekiel, you cannot bring back my family. However, you can save the sun for those kids. Was casting lengthy shadows as it began to set. Ezekiel glanced across the valley at his raising his livestock, leading a modest life. Constructed to get away from his entire past. Seemed pointless all of a sudden in comparison to 43 kids. Who would perish if he made the decision comfort rather than bravery? Yet the choice he was about to make would decide if he passed away as the coward who fled, either as the man who comes from Deadwood Creek, or eventually mustered the courage to confront his. Ezekiel entered his cabin. Failures then came out a few seconds later with his. He had concealed it in the sheriff's badge. Unable to dispose of an old coffee tin despite his embarrassment, in his hand, metal felt weighty and chilly. Weighted despite all of his errors. And all the opportunities he had lost too. All right, I'll assist you, he said. Securing his shirt. With the badge, rather than because I am deserving of forgiveness, but because Sarah, those kids deserve to survive. For the first time since, I nodded. She had come with something that could have her eyes sparked with respect this won't cause us any harm, not even Ezekiel. Bring my family back, he said. Then perhaps we may prevent another family from experiencing what you went through. While Racing Elk got down his horse and walked toward them both. My troops will accompany us on our voyage. Our people have been robbed by the Garrett gang, seized our horses and slaughtered our young men. Within an hour, this debt is transferred both ways. Ezekiel had prepared to depart, gathered his provisions for weapons, and as Sarah had evolved into her best horse, equipped with functional riding attire and herself with a gun that appeared, used and meticulously preserved, the warriors stepped out of their positions. A disciplined force around the valley, bonded by a common desire to defend innocent lives as they left Cedar on horseback. Ezekiel and Canyon came to the realization that Sarah's strategy has been flawless since she hadn't merely wanted to kill at first. She had intended to make him become 3 years ago the man he ought to have been, the man who completed what he began, a man who shielded the defenseless instead of fleeing his shortcomings. The alliance was odd and shaky. A young woman who was a disgraced former sheriff overwhelmed with the desire for fairness, and the Kiowa War Party came together in their resolve to protect the children they'd never met, but it was strong as well. Possessed abilities that the Garrett gang wouldn't expect, to know things they couldn't expect, and drive that ran more profound than mere avarice. The journey to Millfield would lead them through hazardous area, beyond other communities that might not accept the sight of Kiowa warriors with weapons. But Ezekiel had a strange sense of hope for the 3 years for the first time. Not because he thought he may gain some pardon, errors were too significant for that, yet since he was at last able to utilize his remorse for anything constructive. Sarah silently rode next to him for the first time. A few miles before whispering, "My father claimed that decent folks weren't those who were perfect. They were those who have the guts to make the necessary repairs their errors, regardless of how serious they cost them." Ezekiel gave a sympathetic nod. This was the closest thing to forgiveness, as if he were to receive anything from her. It would have sufficient 4 days after the kid's train arrived in Millfield. Station would discover not only the Garrett gang is preparing for an ambush, but a group of resolute guardians on standby to guarantee that the innocent, this time, would not bear the consequences of malevolent men's. The man who had before been greedy unwillingness to acknowledge his shortcomings was ultimately he should be prepared to become the sheriff. Then all along, if you found this enjoyable, amazing tale of salvation and justice, please subscribe to our channel for additional incredible stories from the American. Click on this video on your device frontier screen to listen to another interesting tale concerning the stagecoach driver who found that his passenger was the most wanted criminal in 3 different territories, but additionally she was the only one who could click now to save his dying daughter.